In this flash lecture, I review the idea behind writing a summary and how we will be writing summaries for our course. The objectives for our course include students should know which rubrics to use to assess their summaries, students will understand what makes a good summary, and students should be able to review their summary drafts to revise them. In preparation for viewing the materials contained within these slides, this presentation assumes that you have read about and have used the UNF Write self-talk rubrics. If you haven't read about and used these rubrics, you should ensure that you reviewed the Using Rubrics PowerPoint in the Lectures folder. To begin, we ask the generic question of what is a summary? Well, it's kind of a silly question insofar as we understand this word in an everyday usage, but we're going to refine it here. So a summary is, loosely, a restatement of information. It's also the sum of an item's parts, and for our purposes, a summary is explicit, not mysterious. It's not implicit. It doesn't hide information, doesn't hint at information. It states an inventory of information. I've underlined and bolded the first part of the word summary here for you to focus on what the idea behind a summary is and where the root comes from. A summary is the total collection of something, of its parts, the sum. You could use a math metaphor here and consider an equals sign. All the parts on one side of an equal sign equal the sum when added together, for example. What is the purpose of a summary? Well, it depends on the context. For example, summaries give an overview of larger texts. They also abridge a lengthy work. They can acquaint readers with longer works, and they can also be used to save a reader time. We'll talk more about that in a second. Examples of summaries you may have encountered or may not have yet seen, but a Netflix description. Whenever you go to your Netflix account and you read the description of a media, whether it's a movie or a TV show, you usually get a brief description. You don't get the beginning, middle, and end. Instead, you get just a description of to kind of whet your appetite. If you ever looked at the back of a book or the inside of a book, you normally get the idea, the framing of the idea behind a book. You don't get how it ends. You don't get how it has its middle parts or beginning set up. Instead, you get some sort of introductory idea that lures you in and, again, is attempts to whet your appetite. More academically, we see lab report abstracts or business report executive summaries in proposal or report materials. These latter three pieces are documents that you will likely have to compose throughout your college writing career. So it's important that you understand how to approach the idea of a summary in terms of academic and professional summaries. For our purposes, a summary boils down its material to essential information. Well, this is a loaded statement then. What makes information essential and what makes other information non-essential? What it comes down to is you as the reviewer or the summarizer must decide. You have to determine what is the main focus. And once you've determined a main focus of a piece, you find all the subparts that support it and exclude that which falls outside of that umbrella. We'll return to this idea in a second when we talk about the opening of a summary and how we determine what that paragraph, for our purposes, will detail. The basic summary. For our purposes, again, you're writing one paragraph of no more than 250 words. For this reason, you need to think economically. That is, you want to make sure you fall under that cap of 250 words. This is not about trying to cut out a whole bunch of information and including other information. It's deciding which information is valuable and ranking it in priority. The first sentence then, whether you're writing a paper, whether you're writing a paragraph, you want to open with something that lets the reader know what the context is. Well, for our purposes then, the first sentence should be a sentence that, one, offers a restatement of the source text, two, identifies its context, whether by name of author, the title of the work, as well as the purpose. You may relate this back to a thesis statement if you want. But for our purposes, for all 9 reading notes, for all 6 readings that you do, whenever you do a summary, you need to know the author and the text title and its purpose. So this may be a good reason for you to take more time, if you're not already, in completing your rhetorical reading notes. The more substantial your rhetorical reading notes, the better you will have information ready and at your ready to compose these summaries. The summary identifies a trajectory, so the reader knows what to expect. Again, you are not writing a mystery paragraph here. You're writing an explicit guide for the reader in the hopes that he or she will be able to save his or her time as he or she reads through the paragraph. So in this way, if you let the reader know ahead of time what the parts that you will discuss include, you help the reader. You prepare the reader to label the parts. You make the paragraph predictable. Predictable is not boring. Predictable is preparing. The summary paragraph should also include no analysis. Analysis is not antithetical to summary, but it's the next step when we talk about analysis and summary. And you shouldn't mention any outside materials. That is, when you're summarizing a text, you don't need to include what you think about the text, as you are not part of the text. Any analysis you include is also beyond the text. You only want to mention what the parts of the text actually are. Again, your goal here is not to surprise the reader. The reader is looking for information, and you aim to save the reader time. What should any reader know in taking away from this paragraph about the text that you summarized? That's a generic summary. If you want to compose a better summary, you want to accomplish those few steps as well as identify at least one major point of the source text. Identify rhetorical elements of the source text. You want to be able to describe it. You want to note, what's its organization? Is it broken down into subheaded sections? Is it numbered in parts? How is it broken apart? What's the tone like? Is it academic? Is it playful? Is it informative? Is it evaluative? What's the actual approach of the writer, for example? Is the person trying to be didactic to give you information? Is the person withholding information to make you think about something? What kind of diction is the writer employing, for example? Is it at a certain level? Is it appropriate, for example, for school children in kindergarten, 5th grade, 12th grade, graduate school, postdoctoral work? Who is the audience, and how can you tell what kind of diction betrays that audience? Your basic summary and your better summary need to rely on your own words. That is, you don't need to use quotes. If you can't say something better than the author wrote it, that makes sense to quote. But in general, you want to be able to describe everything in your own words so you can save on the space and be economical. To compose an even better summary, then, you need to accomplish those few things, as well as to differentiate among the source text's major points. You need to identify more than one major point and draw lines between them. You also need to make sure that you're only writing in third-person point of view and only with present tense verbs. 2 notes here. The reason you need to write in third-person point of view is that you want to make sure that you are keeping to an objective, archaeological, anthropological approach here and noting what you've read and what it is. It's like doing an inventory if you work in a warehouse. You just want to label what's there, organize the information, and put it into a coherent format. Present tense verbs. This is because whenever we discuss any literature, and this doesn't mean poetry or drama or fiction, literature in the written sense is always ongoing. That is, right now Sam Kimball's essay is doing something. Anyone can read it, anyone can write about it, anyone can think about it. It's ongoing. So employ present tense verbs. The best summaries, that is A-level summaries, accomplish all of those things as well as they ensure they connect all the main points to the central idea. So they espouse some sort of organizational principle. They also employ important examples or terms from the original document and define those. For example, if you were summarizing Kimball's essay about self-talk, you would want to define self-talk, important language in that way. These 10 things you can find inside of your Demonstrating Mastery of a Summary rubric and form a checklist. We'll talk about that in a second. I provide for you here a sample summary. A student from a previous semester summarized a text from another textbook. You can read this here if you want to pause the screen and read these lines. They're not very long. I think it's about 9 or so sentences. I've broken it down, though, into smaller parts. So I've underlined here the first sentence. In Metaphor and War, the metaphor system used to justify the war in the Gulf, George Lakoff writes about the different metaphor systems and the applications of these systems in order to show how dangerous metaphors can be when they are ignored or misinterpreted. Period. This is the topic sentence. If you were to guess what the rest of the paragraph discusses, you would probably have some pretty good hints, if not explicit direction, for what to expect. We know which essay is being discussed. We know whose writing we're discussing, George Lakoff, and what he discussed in his essay. Seems like different metaphor systems, as well as applications. And then finally, the purpose of that source text. Apparently, this Lakoff writer wanted to show how dangerous metaphors can be. Moving forward, then. I've redded and bolded this information for you so you can kind of see how this paragraph is what we call organized. There's a certain focus here that's repetitive. We shouldn't think about repetitive as being boring. Rather, we might think of repetitive here as being for the sake of the reader. It keeps us focused. It keeps things moving forward. It's not Pulitzer writing, but it's information, and it's delivered in a way that's consistent and kind of rolls forward. We'll talk about one of the deficiencies, though, in this kind of writing, in this specific piece of writing here. One of the things I like to do when I take apart a paragraph of my own writing or any student's writing is to put it into numbered sentences, such as you see here. You might think about how a recipe looks. That first sentence tells us what we're making, and sentences that follow explain how to accomplish that. Read through these numbers 2 through 9 and see, could you write them in any other order, or do they make sense in another way, or are there connections missing? So for example, every single one of those 2 through 9, except for 7 and 8, start with lake off in a verb. There's no connection, though. There's no connectivity. There's nothing that explains, in this next part, he does this. Although we do see that in sentence 7, when the writer explains, in the next section. So we do get a sort of relationship between the content and the original source text here. But throughout, there's no good transitional language. There's nothing that espouses any sense of cohesion from sentence to sentence. And because of that, this paragraph reads like a bullet point list that has no organizational principle. Finally, as I referred to earlier, the mastery of the summary rubric here. You'll find, I think, 12 actual levels, but we're only really concerned with numbers 1 through 10. We can exclude 0 here for the reason that in order to receive a 0, you'd have to not turn in anything or summarize the wrong text. However, we get to the levels 1, 2, 3, 4. You might think about these as D, C, B, A level writing. So for example, if you accomplish all 10 of those things, well, that's an A-level summary. If you only accomplish 4 of those things, though, that's somewhere between 1 and 2. You can convert all of these statements into questions to see if you actually are doing these or accomplishing these ends, or you can make it into a checklist. You can cross through. Does my summary offer a statement of the source text? This is a true-false statement. Does it or does it not? If it doesn't, well, you know that you need to go back and add that in. Does my summary identify a context for the reading? That is, the author or the intended audience or occasion? Well, that's true or false again. And you continue throughout in this way to determine, does my writing include these aspects to accomplish what a good summary should do? Some final thoughts as you compose your summaries here for the first and second drafts. Be explicit. Don't beat around the bush. Don't try to use fancy language. Don't do anything that gets you away from the topic at hand. Avoid being implicit or hinting. Be consistent. Don't be afraid of sounding repetitive for the sake of helping your reader focus. That is, it's okay to use the same starting language for each sentence as long as you connect the thoughts sequentially or consequentially. Use a concrete sentence subject. This relates to the style of the paragraph. That is, when we use something like the text or the author, or Kimball does, or Kimball reads, we have an easy way as readers of understanding and taking apart that context and reading that sentence in a concrete way. Whereas we might find something more abstract, difficult to read, or when things are more than one words for sentence subjects, you find they're harder to read. I'd like to point you at this time to the style how-to in the lecture folder. Here you'll find information about abstract and concrete sentences in more detail. I'll also be creating another PowerPoint and a discussion of style because of its importance to this class. Relatedly, use action verbs for each subject. I won't say that using any form of to be, that is, was, were, for example, is a poor choice, but oftentimes those are better served for definitions, whereas we can find better, stronger words, stronger verbs that'll save us space when we have to be economical. The last two are kind of silly because they're obvious, but always run your spell check. That doesn't mean you should assume Word will catch your errors. Oftentimes it doesn't, and sometimes it catches things that aren't errors and calls them errors and asks you to fix them. Do not be passive in this. Be aggressive. Ask the question, is it right or am I right? Do I know the rule or don't I know the rule? Lastly, always read your summary aloud to yourself in a conversational tone. In this way, you're able to find and locate mechanical issues. The alternate here is that you could ask someone else to read your summary to you, and when you hear that person stumble, or when you hear that person have problems understanding what he or she is reading to you, you know there's a problem with the expression of your content. They're silly and no one wants to do them. These are steps that few people actually take, and you can understand why. But when you take advantage of your own time to create a new procedure in this way, you'll find that you produce better, more consistent, mechanically sound writing.